Welcome to the life of Tash Mia. I'm Tash. Today I've got a good friend of mine, Josh. He's a rigger, and you're going to learn exactly what that means. We're going to be talking all things ropes, Shabari, and kink. So, welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Tash. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for coming today.
That's my pleasure.
Now, I just want to get people knowing a little bit about who you are and a bit of your background and how you got into ropes.
All right. So, look, I've been floating around the scene for maybe 15 years now. All started way back when in I would have been about 24. I got dragged to Hellfire for the first time after talking to a girl that I was dating, and I always had fantasies, even going back to we're talking primary school, of bondage and restraining people and being restrained. It was like a bit of give and take there, but I never had the, I guess you could say, confidence. And in terms of ropes, that started probably around 6 years ago. I'd seen a bit about Shabari and a bit about bondage with ropes here and there, but it wasn't really something that necessarily grabbed me until actually I got a partner who was very heavily into being tied. And I'm like, oh, well, let's see what this is about. And so I started taking lessons, I started attending workshops, and whilst me and her have gone our separate ways, I never stopped tying and got more and more into it. And it wasn't until my next partner after that where I discovered what it was like to have a very strong bond and rope connection, because we started off as friends that just tied to practice, and that was the foundation of our relationship, which was an amazing year together. And after that, I sort of looked at it from a different perspective. Initially, it was about, making pretty shapes and, being the star of the party. And after that, it was more about sharing a really, really special energy connection and space with someone.
It's interesting. I mean, there's a few things I want to go back over there, but it's interesting how you say it goes from being just, the aesthetic and making pretty patterns or pretty shapes or whatever, and it becomes about what's happening between you and that other person. And I think it can be similar in what I do, where I always say I can teach any monkey how to use the tools.
Yeah.
Like literally, I can teach anyone to do that. What I can't teach is how you're going to carry yourself, the person you're going to be, and how you're going to be able to exchange energy with another person. I mean, I coach that in people, obviously, but that's the thing that makes you, and that's what makes you so unique, and that's what makes the art form, I think, so special. And it's interesting when you get that crossover, when it goes from being, okay, I'm just learning how to tie up someone, or I'm learning how to ball bust someone, into what's actually happening here. When in your journey did you notice that crossover? Like, I'm going from just literally learning a skill into I'm actually learning it like an art form, I guess.
When it stopped, so probably about 6 months to a year into tying, it stopped being paint by numbers, I guess you could say. I still followed very distinct patterns and specific methodologies, but I started integrating my own variations and tweaks, and I started to flow more with the rope. I was thinking less about what I was doing and more about the person I was with. And that's sort of when that sort of crossover happened. It became less about, all right, I need to do this next. Oh, this is coming up. Oh no, I've done that slightly wrong. Oh no, it's thrown everything out. And it's just like, shit happens. Let's just keep going. And I'm still in this space with this amazing human, and let's see where we can go with it.
That's interesting, because I was actually learning a new tie recently for a performance I was doing. And I can get very caught up in what comes next, do this next, got to do it right. And I always remember when you first started teaching me that you said it doesn't really matter. Like, if you don't do it perfectly, it doesn't really matter how you get there. And that's actually always stuck with me. And I'm like, no one is going to know if I went the wrong body direction on that, or whatever. It's got to be something beyond that. It's got to be about what's happening this moment, what's exchanging with me and this person that I'm doing it with. That's where the magic comes in.
Yeah, 100%. And what a lot of people do, as you said, is get caught up in the particulars. Like if you do a friction that goes left instead of right, but it still ends up in the same place, it's going to be fine. There are certain things that you can't sway on, like safety and making sure tension is correct if you're going to do a suspension, but it's also a balancing act.
Definitely. When you were just taking you back to when you were first getting in the kink scene, were you nervous to get into it? Were you excited to get into it? Like, what was the feelings coming up for you when you were getting into it?
There was a lot of nervousness. There was definitely, I guess, some repressed shame that a lot of people would have because it was diverging from the norms. I'd always been brought up in very heteronormative spaces, despite having a fairly forward-thinking, open family. So I was a little bit, I guess you could say, embarrassed. Like I'm like, oh, people are going to judge me. People are going to judge me, and it took a while for me to get to a point where I just didn't care. Initially, there was the anxiousness of excitement coupled with the what if people I know see me and they see me doing these things. And then it's funny, a little sidetrack anecdote. I did run in across people at outside Hellfire one day, and I was trying to wear my normie clothes, but it was the one night I decided to wear a Borat mankini. And a friend of mine's just like, you wearing a mankini? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, all right, close off and go for a run. And they bullied me into like doing a run up Oxford Street at like 2 a.m. in the morning in a mankini, which was hilarious at the time. And that was probably about 3 years after I got into the scene. I'm like, you know what? I just don't care anymore. Like, it doesn't get any worse than this.
Are you like on that line? Are you completely out to every like one in your life now? Like that you're in the
Yeah,
kink scene. You're
I don't hide it from anyone except professionally. Like, obviously, I do have a professional career in a 9 to 5. There are some colleagues that know about it and actually come to me for advice because they're all like, they're all getting into it later on in life. But as a general rule, like, even my mum knows about it. My mum has a friend who's a very good artist, and he does pencil photorealism, and he was doing a Shabari series, and they were talking about it drunk one night, and she's like, oh, actually, my son does that, and then put me in touch, and he did a photorealistic sketch of one of my ties
that's incredible.
that I have framed at home.
Oh wow, that's amazing. And it's nice to think that parents can be supportive
Yeah.
of such a thing, which is not always the case.
It took a long time.
Fair. How would you? So not everyone obviously understands Shabari or ropes. Can you give people just like a quick little breakdown of like what is Shabari? Also, what is kind of Shabari versus just rope restraint?
Okay, so this is my perspective. I guess I should preface it. My interpretation is that Shabari is like, going historically, the offshoot of a military practice called Hojujutsu from sort of feudal Japan, and it was a way that they restrained prisoners martially. It has evolved over the time to become more of a sexual practice, and I think it saw a massive resurgence probably around the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s with Akechi Denki in Japan was one of the major players, and it's just slowly but surely spread around the world. The difference I'd say between Shibari and rope bondage is that Shibari follows very specific patterns and styles and ties, and is kind of, I wouldn't say limited in scope, but very particular. Whereas you have sort of European and American rope bondage, which doesn't follow that as closely, is a lot more flexible in the types of rope they use, in the style of rope they do. You can usually tell the difference between sort of a Japanese style shibari and, say, an American style rope bondage by the rope they're using. You'll find that Japanese shibari artists will use, almost exclusively jute, with some using hemp-based rope, whereas, you've got your paracords, you've got your nylon, you've got your polyethylene, all those ropes that they will happily use. The silk ropes, they look pretty, but they're not structurally sound and they stretch too much. So I'm kind of a shibari purist.
And I still buy jute ropes because of you. I was like, jute ropes the only way to go. How do you feel about power dynamics and Shabari or rope play?
Well, Shabari and rope play is inherently a power exchange. Like there is a top, there is a bottom. It doesn't necessarily mean dominant or submissive. And it really depends on the person I'm interacting with. Like I have scenes where it is purely technical and artistic. Like there is no connection, there is nothing intimate or sensual about it. It's just, I'm here to put rope on you and we're going to take photos and it's going to look pretty. There's no power dynamic there. It's very much, the tension's usually a little bit looser. It's usually slower and more deliberate. So I want to put things in certain places. I want to make sure it's a lot more aesthetically appealing. And then you've got ties with like my partner, Ava, where we will go through the motion of getting connected. There'll be, cuddles and tender touching to start with, pulling her hair and putting her into the position I want and guiding her body before I put the ropes on. And then it's a lot more harsh.
Can you give people a bit of like a description of like what is a torture-based tie and like what's the difference between if you were just going to tie someone for an aesthetic?
So a torture-based tie can fall into many different categories. You've got compression, you've got torsion, you've got also like stretching people into different otherwise uncomfortable positions. Twisting the body is torsion. Compression is like squeezing the chest with tight rope. Then you've also got like sort of crushing, where like toe torture and toe rope would be wrapping a rope around a big toe and then pulling it out and towards, say, an upline during a suspension, and that puts it in a very uncomfortable position, but it isn't particularly hazardous. Like there's a danger associated, of course, but the idea is to inflict discomfort and pain without inflicting injury. An aesthetic tie that I would do would be more focused on sustainability and in terms of in comfort, like making it as comfortable as possible. Because often the difference between something being comfortable and painful is the angle that you put them in. So I can put someone in a box tie or a TK that I've taught you, and if I just do a simple side suspension with a hip line and a thigh line and an ankle line, there's 4 points of contact there where the load is being put through the point. In order to make that more uncomfortable, I can take away the hip line. There's only 3 points of contact. Or I could change the thigh line to a futomomo, which is a leg tie which binds the calf or the lower leg to the upper leg. And then I can just run 2 lines, one from the futomomo, one from the box tie. And then I can then invert the person, and then a lot more weight will go towards their chest, giving them chest compression. So there's a lot of crossover in what I can do with different ties as how you position the model that will impact how they feel it.
That's really interesting. And also like the thing that comes to my mind obviously is like safety precautions. And like I know you are very well versed in all this, but as a general, do you see this as a forefront of people who do practice? As in taking safety precautions before they get into their practice, or even when they're learning, do you see that people take it very seriously or?
I do. So it depends on where people are learning. Those that learn in person with like experienced instructors and at like Studio Kink in Sydney, Shabari Sydney, it was imprinted upon me from my first lesson, and the dangers that we're exposed to wasn't dumped on me all in one go. It was relative to what I was doing in the moment. And I think that's another important thing, is not to overload information. So we learn basic sort of anatomy and biology in terms of the way that nerves run through the body, from the neck down into the arms. Biggest risk is obviously radial and ulnar nerve compression. We also learn about less common stuff, like there's some nerves in the thighs that if you go too tight or too long in, say, a futomomo, it can actually cause a dead zone on the thigh. And it is heavily impressed upon us that be aware of our bodies, be aware of our bunnies, be aware of our ropes, and even more so is the education. I've seen this particularly in the last few years, a lot more education targeted towards models, bottoms, / bunnies, whatever you want to call them, to sort of encourage them to have their voice and use it. A lot of people, particularly, and I've noticed not just in rope, but in there would be a bottom or a sub, they don't want to ruin the vibe, ruin the scene, disappoint their top or their dom. And I'm a switch, so I know that feeling as well. Unfortunately, for the longest time, people were not going, hey, no. You've got a voice, use it. Scenes can be repeated. Injuries take a lot longer to recover from, so speak up.
I mean, I see this a lot in my work, working with submissives. They don't want to disappoint you, or they're trying to push through their own limits. It could even just be something that they're trying to do. And I mean, I do take it upon, especially because I'm in a professional setting, it is my job to read it as well, not just them using their safe words, because they don't always use their safe words and they don't tap out sometimes where they do. But there obviously is going to be situations where you haven't read it. And so I think that is such an important point to bring up. And I don't think it's always talked about enough that submissives really do need to use that voice, and that it's not something that, like I always say, you will never get in trouble for using a safe word. You will get rewarded. And that's why I always use like traffic light system. I'm always say, tell me when you get to an orange rather than a red, because orange I can do something with, red I have to break scene. So tell me at the point before you get there. But you're right, a lot of people don't speak up, and it is seen as like, oh, like they're disappointed with themselves, or they can get quite bad sub drop afterwards from having to tap out.
Yeah, 100%. And for me, when it comes to rope, I'll generally, before, especially if it's someone that I'm not particularly familiar with, I'll be like, look, can you do me a favor and give me a heads up when you've got, say, 2 minutes left? Because give me that, because no suspension or tie is infinitely sustainable. There's a time limit and it varies by person. I go via rule of thumb 30 minutes, but just give me, if you're going to, if you're running out of steam, give me a heads up 2 minutes beforehand, because that way I can integrate that in and make it less rushed and less of a panic untie to rescue you from a hazardous situation. Whereas if you give me a heads up, then we can just go easy, take it chill, and you'll be out before it becomes a problem. And the other thing is, you're right, a lot of the time people don't call their safe words, even in ropes, but it's also the responsibility of the top to check in and monitor the bottom's position. I don't always take verbal acknowledgement at face value, particularly when it comes to hands and nerves. I'm like, how you feeling? Yeah, good. All right, cool. I got my hand in your left hand, squeeze it, cool. I can feel that you've got full motion, full range of motion. Do the right hand. Is everything feeling normal? Oh, actually, it's slightly tingly. Okay, cool. Let's adjust it and keep going, or let's finish up.
Mm-hmm. Have you, I mean, I'm sure you would have, everyone's had this who's in Kink, a time that you just haven't read well and it's just not gone right?
Yeah, anyone that says they haven't is lying. So the one that comes to mind is actually a tie that I have up on my Instagram, and I debated about posting it because it was a failed tie. Not because I did anything wrong, not because Ava did anything wrong, but there was a nerve compression. We weren't aware of it. She wasn't aware of it until the rope came off. It was a very, very challenging position. It was on the floor, looked amazing, so pretty. But when I took the ropes off, she's just like, I can't move my arm. And I'm like, what? And she's like, from my shoulder down, can't move my arm. And I'm like, you sure? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, so I picked up her arm and it flop. And I'm like, okay, yeah, this is completely misread. And I'm like, did you feel anything? She's like, no, I didn't feel anything. I just, when the rope came off, doesn't work. And it was beyond my experience level and my knowledge. So luckily one of our friends is a physical therapist. And I'm like, hey, mate, can you come and help us? I'm outside of my element here. Can you see if there's anything wrong? It turns out it was particular to her. There's just like a little nerve exposure on her neck that has been compressed before, and the same thing has happened. Took about 3 hours and she was okay, but now we're aware of it for next time.
I think it's really powerful that, like, because I saw that post, that you do share that, because you are someone who is experienced and you are very good at what you do. You are recognized in the community. And as you said, it happens. We all make mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes. And I think the most important thing in kink and BDSM or whatever space you're playing in is to acknowledge that we are always learning and we do make mistakes. But it's about how we recover from them. And even an example with is when I teach people about talk and during scenes, I say to people, talk to me is an activity. And it's something that needs to be negotiated as if it is an activity. But I always say you are going to make mistakes. No matter how much you negotiate up front with someone about what they want spoken or words to be used, you are going to make a mistake. But what's important is how you recover from it.
100%. It's only ever a mistake if it's not a lesson.
Exactly.
Everything else is just a lesson.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions you have seen in regards to rope tying or Shabari practice?
That it's inherently painful, I think, is a big one. Everyone seems to think, oh, it's going to hurt. It's only going to hurt if you want it to hurt. It's only going to hurt if I want it to hurt. I've done ropes that have been, or ties that have been completely and utterly relaxed. And people have come away from it saying it feels just like a giant hug. And other people think that it's a fight or a struggle, and because of the restraint and the implied claustrophobia of being completely constricted. It can be that way, but one thing that I give advice to anyone that I've tied that's new is don't fight it. Like, relax. The more you relax, the more you fall into a space. That's probably the biggest misconception, is that it's painful and that it's like panic-inducing, claustrophobic. Other than that, not really much that sort of sticks out to me. Just the pain and the constriction.
It's funny, that's the biggest misconception when people ask me is that BDSM is painful. And I'm like, it doesn't have to be. There's so much more to it than pain. And even activities you traditionally would say are painful don't have to be. So it's funny that they're the same. Obviously, you're in the kink scene as well. What has been the biggest misconception, do you think, about being in the kink scene that people who might not have so much knowledge about it is?
Thanks to 50 Shades of Grey, shitloads, that people don't have voices, particularly submissives. I think that a lot of the new people that come into the scene, dom and submissive, believe that they are either not entitled to speak up or that they're entitled to people, either, like vice versa. That's probably the biggest misconception. I also think that there's been a bit of a trend that submissives hold all the power, and I used to believe that for a long time. I think that it's a shared power. Power exchange in and of itself is the submissive giving permission, but also the dominant being responsible for that power that they're given. Another one is that doms can't safe word is a big misconception. If you're a top, you have the right to say no as well.
I love both those points you bring up about submissives hold the power, because I used to say that if you had asked me a couple of years ago. I actually did a post recently about it's a loaded question. Does the submissive hold the power? And I agree, like, yes, because they can call it. But at the same time, power, I do think power does go between the two, as you're right. And it is also, as the dominant, you are entrusted with a lot of power. Yes, from the submissive, but I do think it is, as we say, it's a power exchange. So the power is going back and forth. And you're right, people don't talk a lot about dominance reaching their limits. And especially during scenes, we might be asked, especially in that pre-negotiation chat, we'll both share our boundaries and limits. I think that's quite common. But when you say, like, yeah, if a dominant used a safe word in a scene, I don't think that's talked about or embraced enough. And
it's barely even mentioned.
And to be honest, I can't even think of a scene I've witnessed that a dominant has actually used a safe word.
Yeah, well, I have actually safe worded before.
Have you?
As a dominant, yeah.
In a rope scene or just in a play scene?
I've called scenes many, many times because it was getting beyond my comfort zone.
I love that.
I had an impact scene once upon a time where me and two friends were wailing on a girl and she just kept asking for more. And I said, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And if we do this anymore, you're not going to be sitting for a week. And I said, you've had enough. In rope scenes, I've had people get either unwell or they've gotten probably a little bit too excited. And I said, this is getting beyond what we negotiated. So I think it's time to finish it up. So yeah, like I have no problem calling a scene if I'm not feeling comfortable with where it's at.
I love that because, yeah, to be honest, I haven't witnessed it myself. Obviously, being a professional, I can easily call it because it's a bit of a different dynamic, obviously, than social play. But yeah, when it is getting out of hand and the sub is wanting more, but the dominant's no longer feeling comfortable, as you said, it's gone beyond the negotiated scope. I think it takes a very strong person to step in and say that.
Yeah, I think comes down to also understanding boundaries and consent because one of the first things that I was taught by Mark Deviate from Studio Kink many years ago is don't escalate mid-scene. Whatever is negotiated, whatever is agreed upon prior to going into the rope is the limit of what you do. And I've tried my best my entire life or my entire kink journey to abide by that.
Yeah.
It saves hassles with people misunderstanding, with consent violations. And at the end of the day, we can always go again.
And it's true. I've had many times in my sessions, I'll have someone turn up and I'll be like, what are your limits? I don't have any. And I'm just like, well, we're not playing then. Or they say to me, you can do what you want. I said, well, I can't do anything without your consent, so we can just sit here and look at each other if you like.
Do you know what you do in that situation? All right, sweet, let's go straight to dry anal fisting. Watch them get limits.
I'm going to try that one next time. I'd love
Specifically dry.
What do you love most, firstly, about ropes? Like, what is the thing that just is ultimate for you?
It's very much the moment that someone melts. Like, if I have a play partner, whatever, and it's not someone that's just in it for the show or for the pretties. It's someone that is genuinely falling into a deep rope space where they are completely relaxed, and I know that I'm the one that has put them in that place. That's where I get my top space. That's my ultimate. That's the pinnacle. That sort of connection. Second to that would be, I really only get this with my partner Ava, because she's the person that I tie that I can do the most, I guess, extreme ropes with, is when I manage to make her scream. And make her do all sorts of contorty, bouncy, fun things.
Do you have a particular like pre-scene and aftercare that you do or you do with your partner?
So that's one thing that Ava and I have been working on a lot in the last few months, because we were getting a little bit disconnected with rope. It was just becoming very clinical, and the only time we really tied was practice. So we tend to just be close. Closeness is important pre-scene. We usually talk about what we want to do first. I ask where she's at with her body for that day, because I tie a bit, she ties a lot. And we sort of find where we want to go on that journey. It's never something that's dictated by me. It's usually something that's agreed between me and her. And we usually have a specific goal in mind. So I want to practice this so we can do this better. And she's like, oh no, I've done too many of them lately. Can we do something different? Yada, yada, yada. Once that's done, we'll sort of cuddle. I'll run the rope over her, run my hands over her body on her legs and her arms before I pull her into the position I need her to be in to start tying. And then throughout the tie, on the floor, on the ground, try and keep, contact with her body in some measure. And that's something that I've had to relearn again recently. In terms of aftercare, aftercare starts from as soon as I start to untie for me. Short of it being like an emergency untie because someone's arm is going numb or whatever, I would try to make sure that it is not a jerky experience. I want it to be quite smooth in transition from being in rope to being out of rope, which means a slow untie, lots of closeness, lots of cuddles, lots of directing the body with subtle movements of mine, grabbing the throat, pulling the hair, redirecting their face so that the hair's out of the way of the rope. And by the time that they are untied, they'll be a floppy mess in my lap, and then lots of cuddles, some water, and if I've remembered to bring them, snacks.
Do you experience, if you're doing a power dynamic tie, especially, do you experience like a dom drop ever?
It's not often, but sometimes I feel a little bit disappointed that it's over because I was having that much fun and I wanted to stay in that space. So that's the extent of my dom drop. I wouldn't say it's ever been as severe as, say, my sub drop has been when I've been a bottom.
Interesting. What do you love now most about being part of the kink community?
I'd say the thing that I love the most is that it's such a diverse cast of characters. There's everyone from every walk of life, every level of experience, every fantasy, fetish, kink catered for, as long as it's, within the bounds of two consenting adults. And despite any shortcomings of it, everyone is committed to creating a safe and inclusive space and continually educating each other. I think that we're getting more and more to a point where ego is slowly but surely becoming less of an issue. I think that as DOMs, we kind of need to support each other more. I think that subs have a really, really, really good space to work with each other and encourage and educate each other. I think that that's where the dominant side is being left out. But the community as a whole is just focused on advancement, development, and progression.
Yeah, I always say, there's a lot of, I think people are drawn to kink, or maybe it's something that develops why you're getting part of the community or building yourself up. There's a theme of self-growth. And I don't know which one comes first, the kink or the self-growth, or it's just a predisposition. But I definitely agree that like a lot of people in the community, they're all willing to learn and to grow. It's interesting what you said about, DOMs supporting each other more. I know like I have a group of DOMs and we like do a DOMs night out and go out to dinner and stuff. And it's only just then when you said that I realized actually that's quite important. And it's actually important that we make sure we do it and get that support from each other, because it's not as focused about, you're right, as it seems.
And I think a lot of it carries on with a lot of, dare I say it, male egos easily getting bruised, because no dom wants to be seen as lesser or weak in the eyes of their submissive or their bottoms. And so it's really, really difficult to separate. Well, no, it's not a weakness to go to someone who's done something that you particularly like that you don't fully understand and ask them, hey, how do you do that? Can you give me some guidance or some mentorship? It doesn't mean that you're lesser. It means you are willing to grow.
And also I've always said this. Well, first I've always said, if you ever meet a dom that says they know everything, run. And also you change as a dom or even as a sub. Like I always said that if you met the dom 5 years ago to the dom I am today, we're completely different. And I'm sure in 5 years I'll be different again. And I think that's really important, that I'm always learning. I never get to this point where I'm like, oh, I know it all. Like I'm at the pinnacle, because that's the day I shouldn't be practicing. If someone wanted to learn more about ropes and Shabari, what would you say is the first places to look? What's a good way of getting into it?
I'd probably look in your local community, in your local area. So we're Sydney based, obviously. So we have Shabari Sydney, we have Studio Kink, and we have a few other smaller little gatherings. I think that it's important that anyone that wants to get into Shibari with any measure of seriousness, that they have in-person training from people who are experienced, that have been there, have done that. The reason being is that it's one thing to look up a pattern online and watch a video on YouTube of someone tying someone. It's another thing to understand placement of ropes, the variances in different body shapes and body types, the tension required for a given tie. And you can only get that feedback if someone is watching you and going, that's wrong or that's right. Otherwise, you would start developing bad habits early. And it's a lot harder to train out bad habits than it is just to do it right the first time. Once you've got the fundamentals, so do a couple intensive courses, workshops, whatever, then by all means explore, because you understand the basics of what you're doing. And then you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense that would follow on from that. And then you can go online and use a whole host of online resources, but definitely get some in-person tuition to start with. At the end of the day, it is risky no matter how much people may downplay it. It is edge play. There is great chances of having major injuries if you are not educated properly and don't practice responsibly.
Great advice there. Final question. I just want to ask you, what do you think is the biggest gift practicing rope or Shabari has given you as a person? And I don't just mean in your kink life, but you as a person in your everyday life.
It gave me an appreciation for my neurospicy mind. I stopped I felt a lot less shame because rope speaks to me, and I didn't actually mention this before, it speaks to me in a way that I like ordered patterns. My ropes generally are very neat, they're very tidy, and they're very by the book. So I've sort of ventured away from that recently just by freeforming, which has been really freeing. But I used to dislike that aspect of my brain, and now I see value in it, and it makes me feel happier to be me. And I've taken that into other parts of my life and applied that to other aspects where I was maybe a little bit more critical upon myself.
That's a really beautiful thing to say. And thank you so much for being here. You are so gifted at what you do. I said this before we even started. One of my most memorable times of witnessing rope was between you and a close friend of mine, and it's honestly something that's stuck with me for years. So it's very powerful what you do.
Thank you so much, Tash.
Thank you for being on here, and thank you for listening. As always, stay kinky.